Well, good morning, everybody. I'm Craig Bauer, as many of you know. Today, Ricky, Paul, and I are going to go through a presentation on an analysis we did that determines whether there's correlations between sentiment and social activity to point of sale, actual point of sale data. And one of the segments we chose was one of the more difficult areas of the publishing market to forecast. So from an agenda standpoint, I'm going to walk through the business problem, one that I actually lived personally for about 4 years. Ricky's going to go through the visualization and the key findings. Paul's going to go through the source code that we used and the workflow process, and then collectively we could go through any Q&A sessions. Just like any other media industry, all these companies and segments have gone through a digital transformation over the last 10 years, in which not only the content is consumed digitally, but often on mobile devices. When you look into publishing segments, each of these segments perform a little bit differently in terms of the market demand for physical product versus digital product. With the scientific, technical, medical community typically buying 70, 80% of their subscriptions, consequently the publisher's revenues are in a digital format, all the way through education and to the consumer trade market. One thing that's certain though is as long as there's demand for a physical product, either by a marketplace, library, institution, school, or a consumer, then those providers are going to come up with a way to fulfill that. Some of these products physically can be done on an on-demand basis, which means they don't have to provide a forecast or create an inventory position. But some of the other products, you need to be able to forecast it, produce it, and send it through the normal physical distribution channels. Some of the ones that are more difficult to forecast are the ones that are in trade. And one part that lends itself to the difficulty is the product life cycle. So if you think of any product classic life cycle, it goes through an introduction, growth, maturity, and decline. And for publishing, some of those are measured in years. But for this particular product category, it's measured in weeks. One way, if you examine these, here's an example of 5 titles. If you look at the weeks, at the end of week 3, 6, 9, and 12, over a 20-week period, you can see that they've achieved somewhere between 25 and 30% of their sales at the end of week 3, somewhere between 50, 60% in week 6, 60 to 70 in week 9, with one of these titles being an anomaly. And so from this perspective of analysis, you would believe that they act or perform in a very common way, when in reality, their volumes are vastly different. These are the same ISBNs or titles that are sold over that same 20-week period, in which some of them performed half of the largest or even 1% of the largest in the same time. So the questions that we wanted to determine is, can celebrity reach dictate or at least provide some forward guidance on volume or demand? Meaning, does followership equal readership? Second part is, the social volume equate to POS activity, meaning the amount of social activity around a particular title drive point of sale demand. Same thing regarding sentiment. Is there a relationship between those two? Is there any correlation between the common book reviewers, which are done again by consumers in a marketplace, to that same social sentiment? And if there is a relationship between these two, is there a visible lag period? So these were the questions that we asked, and Paul's going to walk you through the analysis. I'm sorry, Ricky. Thank you.
So our first question, does social media celebrity reach correlate to volume demand? And the verdict? No, because even the best-selling author doesn't even have a Twitter handle. And even though she does have a Facebook, which is Tina Fey, I'm not sure if you guys know her, but she has a Facebook with only one friend. Maybe we can't see all her friends, but she doesn't have a Twitter handle, which doesn't mean any social media drive or sentiment for her followers. So that kind of concludes that question. Does the volume of social media activity influence POS results? We'd say so. It does by looking at some of the charts that I'll show you for each of the titles that we selected. Bossy Pants, at the publication week, we see the highest amount of Twitter activity and sales. And then over time, as usual, it's pretty much predictive. Over time, it declines and social media activity starts to decline as well. People start reading it, they lose interest, the hype is over with any type of product. And you can kind of see that through all of these charts, except for Instant Mom. It wasn't an instant hit. But so this chart was kind of sporadic. There was a lot of there wasn't much sales nor Twitter activity for this book. And we can see the girl with the lower back tattoo, pretty healthy type of product life cycle. Had a lot of sales at the beginning, almost 40,000 sold books. And then it sharply declined right after the sales, probably due to all the pre-order sales, and everyone who did buy it got their book, read it. There wasn't that much Twitter activity compared to the other books. But, that's pretty much it for the lower back tattoo. The modern romance, this was a little bit more stable. Like for every book, publication week, highest amount of sales and Twitter activity. Everyone's talking about it. They're reading it. Some people even, told their statuses, I'm 7% through the book. I'm like, 7%. Did you actually calculate that? Born a Crime was the exception of all the charts because the Twitter activity, they did have the highest amount of Twitter activity versus publication week. More Twitter activity versus sales. That's kind of the only exception compared to all the books. And it did have... So if you can see, for the first 5 weeks, from publication week to the 5th week, the sales started increasing. So it might have seemed like their advertising or marketing wasn't as up to par as the other books. That's kind of what we concluded out of this Born a Crime title. And then it sharply declines afterwards. So there had to be some sort of marketing technique or failure, I would say, because publication week should have had the highest amount of sold titles or units. And then we're off to, does the sentiment of social media influence POS results? And this, you can kind of see the Twitter activity for all the 5 titles. And they're pretty much, I would say the sentiment doesn't really influence the POS results, because if we go through the charts over here, you'll see that over time the sales and the sentiment, they start to increase, but the sales start to decline as a normal healthy product life cycle. You have the introduction, maturity, growth, and then decline, as Craig told us. It might help a little bit in reducing the decline of the sales, but not as much, because sales still start to rapidly decline after the publication week. And again, Born a Crime is kind of the exception. It's definitely different. Sentiment is pretty consistent, and sales start to increase over time, even after the publication week. We have Instant Mom, again, not an instant hit, unfortunately. Goes kind of sporadically over time. The sentiment, maybe due to the data, the amount of tweets that we got for this wasn't as much as the other books. Han, you have a question?
Just 5 minutes.
Oh, sorry. 5 minutes. All right. So I'm going to just run through these slides. You can kind of see the sentiment and the sales again. Sentiment kind of goes down. There's a spike in sentiment, but does not increase the sales or anything like that. And again, for modern romance. So that's pretty much it. Do book reviews track with social sentiment? No, they're kind of opposite. So you have more negative social sentiment and better book reviews. So that's kind of odd thing that we noticed in the books that we chose. And visible lag period between Twitter activity and POS sales. No, there isn't really much of a lag between that comparison. So you can see the data from here. You have the tweets and the sales, they pretty much line up to the same. You have publication date or release and Twitter activity. It pretty much follows the same consistency. And then we're going to hand it off to Paul to explain the technologies that we used.
Thanks, Ricky. All right. Uh-oh. Yeah, someone came out. Yeah, the screen. Hopefully it's still working. All right, I'm going to try and work quickly through this because we have a lot to unpack here. These are all the technologies that we used. I don't need to go through them on this slide. You can see them, but we're going to go through them right now anyway. So what we started with, we knew that we were going to have POS data for 6 weeks prior to publication date, which is most likely 0 unless there's some pre-orders and some other things, and then 20 weeks after the publication date. We started with 40 different books, which we kind of, the idea was to search if, social media influence of these specific authors helped their POS sales data. What we found out was that a lot of these authors just didn't tweet about their books, didn't have Twitter handles, a lot of different things. So we started whittling down the list, and then we came finally upon a list of 10, and then later we actually moved that down to 5. So we know that we have the books that we're looking for, and we know now that because there's not enough tweets from the authors, we want to try and find non-source tweets, so tweets about the books. So how do we do that? We use Twitter Advanced Search, which is perfect. We just put in the book title for exact phrase. We have a range of dates, which is great. The issue, Twitter doesn't want you to be able to use Twitter Advanced Search through their API. There's no ability to do it. There's no wrappers that do it that we found that you don't have to pay for. So what we did find was that a guy, Jefferson Henrique, he built a package that actually does this for us. He figured out a way to emulate the scrolling of Twitter Advanced Search. The only problem is he uses Python 2, well, one of the problems. So we built a virtual environment that uses Python 2. So this is his code for get all tweets, and this is exactly what we want. Tweet criteria, you search your query, the different time frames, so we want to do that for each week so we can match that up against the POS data. Now, we're not going to alter this code 260 times, 26 times for each book, so we need to do a for loop. So this is his code, and this is our code. So we have lists of books across the top there, 10 books, start dates, 1 and 2, which is the first date of the week and the last day of each week that starts. We have a for loop through a zip, so it loops through it simultaneously. And then we have a check here that checks through each book to make sure if there's any errors, we know about them, and a counter for the file name. And then we move the days over with time delta. Now, this all works great until Twitter blocks your IP address on a Friday night. And then your code doesn't work Saturday morning. So I just want to take a quick moment to thank our sponsor for today, Windscribe VPN, for when you get blocked by Twitter 3 times in 2 weeks for non-related incidents. Use code dude, where's my data for 50%? No, I'm just kidding. But it's a good segue into what we ended up doing to try and protect against that. We didn't end up having to use the VPNs because we just changed our code a little bit. So we only look for 1 book at a time, although it does loop through all 26 weeks, so we get the same data. What it produces, these CSVs of beautiful, beautiful tweets, they look great. We have exactly what we need, username, date, retweets, text. One of the issues was that the way we built the files, we used a comma delimiter, which made every tweet that had a comma in it split into multiple columns. So we literally could not load it into Python or anything. So we did what no one ever wants to do, the unthinkable. We use VBA. So this VBA script isolates where the status ID is and then moves everything over. It concatenates the actual tweet into the correct column, then moves all the columns over. Really fun. Around this time, we also used the Goodreads API to request the review data for each book. It was originally coming in XML Craig was able to find a wrapper that Goodreads built for their own API that actually returns it in JSON. So we used that and the ISBN numbers to make sure we had the right edition of each book. And this is when we're going to move to the Jupyter notebooks really quickly. So this is the first Jupyter notebook. So we imported our data, and originally we wanted to loop through each CSV file that we made and do the sentiment analysis at that time. It was around that time that we figured out that we used different dates for the POS sales data and the actual tweet retrieval. So instead we built big data frames of each book and then made masks right up here for the correct dates. So we had a separate data frame and then made masks so we had the correct dates for the sentiment analysis. Then we created data frames of weekly sales, weekly sentiment, weekly tweets from all of our data for each book. One thing I'll point out here is, I'm sure you noticed, Amy Schumer's wonderfully named The Girl with the Glower Back Tattoo. Figured we wouldn't have a chance to do this again, so the data frame's named Back Tattoo. I don't know how often we're going to be able to name a variable like that, so we did that. And then the last Jupyter notebook, I'm not going to belabor it. This is just regular plotting that we did here. We just imported the CSV files and made data frames. We just plotted everything. Here you've already seen many of the plots, and everything is definitely, this is the one thing I want to point out, the two different scales for the bar and the line graph. Everything's definitely perfect here. Definitely don't look at the right side and how these don't match up with the grid lines. That's a joke for one TA. But otherwise, everything looks pretty clean. And then the last thing we did here is I just wanted to see how many tweets we actually used. So I just did this data set, so 70,000 for 5 books, which I think is a pretty hefty data set. So that's pretty much it for us. We have a last slide here, which is just the full workflow that we used. But if anyone, well, this is it. So if anyone has any questions, feel free. Alternatively, if you want to ask about how we did it or anything, I could talk about this for another hour probably. So definitely feel free to reach out to us. We had a lot of fun. It was definitely challenging. It looks simple here, but when we actually did it, it was pretty difficult. So that's it for us.
What we're going to do now is open it up for questions, and then afterwards we'll offer some feedback. So we'll start off with questions from you.
What were the most challenging tasks within your work? Was it really getting the data, or?
I think it was, yeah, it was getting the tweets into the correct format so that we could sentiment analyze. I mean, we needed to get a ton of tweets. It took a little while to figure out how to shape the package code that we found into exactly what we needed to do. He had 2 different files, or 3 different. One used command line inputs. This one was basically just a sample file that I showed you, and then another file that actually saved into CSV. So we basically merged everything and then put the loops on it. So it was pretty difficult. That was probably the most difficult part, I think.
I have a question. What, given that you guys analyzed so many different things and you had such very clear questions from the beginning, what new questions, sparked your curiosity if you could have more time to continue digging in?
If I would want to make this actionable, I'd want to enlarge the data set. Clearly, sentiment isn't correlating. It doesn't look like it is. But tweet volume and POS volume does. The challenge was I was looking for a lag period, meaning does one influence the other, but there wasn't a visible one.
Sorry, you were looking for, sorry.
Meaning if there's a lag period between sentiment volume, not sentiment, but tweeter volume, and then POS follows, that may lead to an opinion that, campaign could drive sales, right? But instead they were largely stacked on top of each other. So the only other part is the sentiment is Bossy Pants was the only one where the sentiment continued to grow if you trend lined it, where the other ones were flat or in decline. And does that give resistance to what is a typical rate of decline of these types of books? Those would be the 2 things I would look for.
One other question. So did you guys do any sort of filtering to see if it was marketing-based tweets or everyday people? Or maybe that wasn't your intention, you were just as curious to see if marketing efforts were
I think we were more, it just, if somebody tweeted about the
Right.
book, it would count it.
Yeah.
But that's definitely a filter we could have used.
We originally wanted to do this, get the celebrities, but we didn't have enough data for the celebrities. Didn't even tweet out enough
Yeah.
about their own book, so
Right.
we couldn't compare them against the regular, customers.
Exactly. The intent was to answer those 5 questions on 2 dimensions. Source being the celebrity tweet, and everybody but the source. But the sources had so little tweet volume, there was nothing really to compare.
It would seem like most celebrities would have a proxy army, which you wouldn't be able to identify who was tweeting on their behalf.
Right. Jacob.
I am wondering, how did you get the point of sale data? Because like
That's a good
that
question.
seems pretty interesting to me. It's not something that a lot of book companies will want to share with you.
We stole
Right.
that.
So, we leveraged a relationship with somebody that had access and subscribes for insight into what the results were.
Other questions?
Like you guys said, like you had a list of books and then you trimmed it down to 10 and 5. Like, what were the reasons?
So it started with 40. The reason why we switched from 10 to 5 is because some of these search terms we couldn't be moderately sure that they were about the actual book. Like "dad is fat." Surprisingly, number of people are tweeting "dad is fat" about being about the book. So something like "bossy pants," we would be pretty sure that they're talking about the book. Things like that. There were some other difficulties that we had, whether it was publication date that was too old, or originally we did cut down the list based on people that didn't have Twitter, because that's how we were doing it originally. So I guess we could have probably taken some of those books back. We just didn't.
So then, like a follow-up question would be, so if that was the problem, like how did you? I'm guessing there's gonna be tweets about people with backpackers.
100%.
How would you differentiate?
So we originally talked about trying to figure out the percentage of a sample and then applying that, extrapolating that across the whole sample. And then when we looked at the tweets, there was like very few that weren't about the book, just because they were such specific book titles. So.
All right, thanks again. So,